The lantern was still warm in my hand when I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened to my wife breathing in the bedroom above me. It was a little after 4 in the morning. The kitchen stove had gone low in the night, and the floorboards were cold enough that I could feel it through my socks. On the table behind me was a folded note from a meeting about things a husband should carry alone. I had read it 3 times by lamplight. Then I folded it again, set both palms on the table, and knew I was going to do the one thing I had just been warned not to do. I was going to tell my wife the truth. And that morning, before the cows were milked and before the children came down rubbing sleep from their eyes, I learned something about marriage that no Ordnung meeting had ever taught me. My name is Jonas. I am a husband, father, and head of a small household in an old order Amish community. I share these stories because most people see only the outside of our life. The buggies, the barns, the plain clothes, the quiet roads. But the heavier parts of a man's life are not always seen from the road. If this story makes you think of something a husband and wife should not have to carry separately, I hope you will leave a comment and tell me what trust means in your own home. This happened 15 years ago, in a winter that came hard and early. I remember it because the first snow fell before the corn was all out of the field, and because my oldest boy was still small enough to fall asleep with his cheek against the kitchen table after supper. We had 3 children then. The youngest was still nursing. My wife Miriam had dark circles under her eyes most mornings because babies do not care how much work waits before daylight. I was doing farm work, some carpentry, and a little repair work for neighbors when they needed a wagon bed mended or a door hung straight. From the outside, it looked like we were getting by. We had bread on the table, we had a horse in the barn, we paid what needed paying, mostly on time. But a man can look steady while he is counting coins in his head every time his wife asks whether there is enough kerosene, enough flour, enough cloth for new shirts. That winter I was behind, not by a little, by enough that I had stopped sleeping well. A repair job I had counted on had gone to another man. A young mare had come up lame, and the blacksmith bill was more than I had expected. Then one of the children took sick with a cough that hung on for weeks. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary trouble stacking itself quietly until a man feels it tying his boots. In our community, a husband is expected to be steady. That word can sound simple to outsiders. It is not. Steady means you do not run your mouth about fear. Steady means you do not make your wife feel unsafe because you are tired. Steady means you lead the home, and if there is worry, you take it into the barn, into the shop, into the field, and you let the sweat pull some of it out of you before you come back inside. There is wisdom in that. A house does not need a man pouring every worry onto the table. Children need a father whose hands do not shake over every small trouble. A wife needs a husband who does not make his own weakness her burden. But there is another thing that can happen. A man can take a good rule and hide behind it until it turns into pride. That is what I did. The trouble started with a meeting at the bishop's house. It was not a formal church matter, not discipline, not a trial of anyone. Several married men were there, mostly men older than me. We sat in the front room with our hats on our knees. The smell of coffee sat in the wool of our coats. The bishop spoke about households. He spoke about debt, about decisions, about how a man must not trouble his wife with every fear that comes into his head. He said a husband should not come home and make his wife carry what he had been appointed to carry. Then an older man across from me, a man whose beard was white at the chin, said one sentence I did not forget. He said, "A woman should know her home is safe before she knows how close the storm is." Nobody argued. I did not argue either. I nodded like the rest of them. But inside, something in me tightened. Because my wife already knew there was a storm. She knew it from the way I paused before answering. She knew it from the way I took longer in the barn after chores were done. She knew it from the way I said, "We'll see," when she asked about small things I should have been able to answer. Women are not blind because men are quiet. That is something I wish I had understood sooner. I came home that night with the bishop's words in my ears and did what I thought a good husband should do. I said nothing. Miriam had supper on the table, potato soup stretched with milk and onion, and bread she had baked that afternoon. The children were noisy, as children are when the day has been too long inside. I remember one boy tipping his spoon and spilling soup down his shirt. Miriam laughed softly, wiped it with the corner of her apron, and looked at me across the table. Just looked. Not accusing, not frightened, waiting. I looked down into my bowl. That was the first cowardly thing I did. After supper, she asked if I had heard anything about the cabinet work from the Miller place. I told her not yet. She asked if we needed to put off buying cloth until spring. I said maybe. She asked if something was wrong. I said no. That was the second cowardly thing I did. I told myself I was protecting her. That sounds better than saying I was protecting myself. A man can dress pride as duty and almost believe it is righteousness. For the next 2 weeks, I carried the worry alone, or at least I pretended I did. I rose earlier, I worked later, I took every small job that came. I fixed a gate in freezing rain and hauled wood until my shoulders burned. But inside the house, the air changed. Miriam stopped asking as many questions. She started making decisions around my silence. She saved scraps I had not asked her to save. She put less butter on the table. She mended socks that should have been thrown into the rag basket. She did all of it quietly, but not peacefully. There is a difference. One night I came in after dark and found her sitting at the table with the baby asleep against her shoulder. The lamp was turned low. There was a stack of mending beside her, and her needle was still threaded, but her hands were not moving. The older children were asleep upstairs. I took off my coat and hung it by the door. She did not look at me right away. Then she said, "Jonas, do not make me guess my own life." That was the line. Not loud, not bitter, just tired and true. I wanted to answer quickly. Men often do that when they are ashamed. We reach for words before we have listened, but something in her face stopped me. She was not asking me to hand her my burden like a sack of feed. She was asking me not to lock her outside the door of her own household. I sat down across from her, and for a while the only sound was the baby breathing against her dress. I told her what I had not told her. I told her about the money. I told her what was owed and what was coming due. I told her which bill had to be paid before the end of the month. I told her I had been afraid that if I said it plainly, she would look at me differently. That was the hardest part to say. Not the numbers. That. I was afraid she would see that I had not been as strong as she thought. Miriam listened without interrupting. She shifted the baby once, slow and careful, and laid him in the cradle beside her chair. Then she came back to the table and asked me to say the numbers again. So I did. She took a pencil stub from the shelf and pulled the back of an old envelope toward her. We wrote everything down. What we owed, what might come, what could wait, what could not. It was not grand, no music, no sudden peace. The stove clicked as it cooled. The lamp smoked a little because the wick needed trimming. My hands were rough and black at the edges from work, and hers were red from wash water. But that table felt different after the truth was laid on it. Heavier, yes, but cleaner. Miriam saw something I had not seen. She knew of 2 sacks of dried apples her sister had brought after harvest. She knew we could trade some for eggs instead of buying. She knew which children could wait on new shoes and which could not. She knew how to stretch a ham bone longer than I thought possible. She knew a neighbor woman who needed help with sewing and might pay in flour. None of those things saved us by themselves, but they were not nothing. And I had been too proud to know them because I decided the burden belonged only in my hands. The next Sunday, I sat in worship with the same men who had been at the bishop's house. The room was full and warm from so many bodies packed close together. The hymns moved slowly, the way they do. Each note held until a man has time to think underneath it. I remember looking at the backs of the other husbands' necks, the hats resting on the bench, the boys sitting stiff beside their fathers, and I wondered how many homes had quiet storms inside them. After the service, the older man with the white beard asked me how things were. I said, "We are working through it." He nodded, then asked whether I had kept the trouble from my wife. I told him no. I told him I had tried, but then I told her. He looked at me for a long time. I expected correction. Maybe I even wanted it, because correction can be easier than sitting with your own decision. But he only said, "Then be sure you told her as your wife, not as your hired man." I did not understand it fully at first. Later I did. There is a wrong way to tell the truth. A husband can come home and dump fear in the middle of the room and expect his wife to clean up the pieces. That is not trust. That is selfishness. A man can speak every worry as soon as it rises, making his home tremble because he has never learned to be still. That is not honesty. That is lack of discipline. But there is also a wrong silence. There is a silence that says, "You are not strong enough to know." There is a silence that says, "This is my household, but not yours." There is a silence that looks like leadership from the outside, but feels like loneliness on the inside. That was the silence I had brought into my kitchen. In the months that followed, things did not become easy. We paid one bill late. I remember because I hated walking to that man's place with my hat in my hand and telling him I needed 2 more weeks. He gave them. He gave them. The mare healed enough for light work by spring. The cabinet work from the Miller place came back after all, though smaller than promised. Miriam and I kept the envelope in a drawer by the stove, and every few nights after the children slept, we opened it. Sometimes we spoke only 10 minutes, sometimes longer. We did not make a habit of feeding fear. We made a habit of telling the truth before fear turned into distance. That is different. I found that my wife did not think less of me because she knew what was hard. She thought less of the silence. I cannot blame her. A wife can stand beside a man under a hard sky, but she cannot stand beside a door he has locked from the other side. Years have passed since then. We have had other winters, some better, some worse. There were years when harvest was good, and years when sickness made money seem small beside breath and fever and prayer at midnight. I have learned that every household has things outsiders do not see. Some men carry regret. Some carry debt. Some carry fear over a child. Some carry a question about faith they would rather not name. We are taught, rightly, to be careful with our words. In our way of life, words are not decorations. They build things or they break things. But I do not believe a wife is honored by being kept in the dark about the life she helps hold together. There are things a husband should not pour out carelessly. There are things he should pray over first. There are things he should take to an older man, to the bishop, to the quiet of the barn before he brings them into the kitchen. But when the matter belongs to the household, when it touches the children, the table, the future, the promises made before God, then silence can stop being strength. It can become a wall. The warning I was given was not evil. It came from men who had seen households shaken by loose tongues. I respect that. I still teach my sons not to make their wives afraid just because they themselves are unsettled. But I also tell them this: your wife is not a child in your keeping. She is the woman who stood beside you when you made your vows. Do not make her live with the consequences of truths you refuse to speak. If you are listening to this and you come from a different life than mine, maybe the road outside your house is louder. Maybe you do not heat with wood or rise for milking before the sun. But marriage is still marriage. Trust still has to sit somewhere real. It cannot live only in words spoken on easy days. It has to sit at the kitchen table when the numbers do not add up. It has to stand in the doorway when one of you is afraid and the other one knows it already. What I understand now is simple. A man should not make his wife carry every fear, but he should not make her carry the loneliness of not knowing either. That morning, when I went upstairs with the lantern and woke Miriam before the children stirred, I thought I was breaking a rule. Maybe I was. But I was also opening a door, and in our home, that mattered more. If this story stayed with you, I invite you to subscribe for more Amish life stories told from inside the home and field. And tell me in the comments, is there a truth you believe husbands and wives should always share, even when it is hard? I read them, and I carry some longer than you might think.